from a legal perspective on urban sustainability. The main objective of the Critical Conversation series is to engage in science discussions, and therefore these events are certainly not only aimed at academic audiences. We in fact invite people in municipalities, councillors, officials, people from civil society, as well as students. We've even had school children participating, and I think that is the important message, that everyone is welcome to ask questions around the topics under discussion, to intervene with practical examples, and even to share some of their own experiences. So you will see that today's topic is very specific. It's on the resilience of environmental systems, why relevant for South African cities. Now, in the context of climate change, global change as such, and even in the context of COVID-19, the resilience of people in South African cities is a very important topic. It's something that's also not easy to achieve. It's cost and time intensive, and it requires skills and a lot of understanding, not only on the part of municipal officials and municipalities, but also on the part of us as ordinary citizens walking the streets of our towns and cities in the country. For now, I'm going to switch over to Maricel. Maricel is going to share with you a few housekeeping rules. She's also going to introduce our speaker. And for now, from my side, just a warm welcome, an invitation to actively participate in the discussion. And thank you for making time this afternoon participating in this CLES event. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining us for our second online critical conversation on the theme, the resilience of environmental systems and why they're relevant for South African cities. Thank you also to Prof. Hanal, our chairholder, for starting off our program. I would like to run through some housekeeping rules to follow for the duration of this event, as well as to allude to the format for the rest of the afternoon. In terms of housekeeping rules, we request our participants switch off their cameras to save data. All participants are to keep their microphones off until we request you to raise your hand at such time where we take questions at the end or when you are called to speak upon. Only switch on your mic when you're speaking. Use the chat function to post and raise questions, or raise your hand to share ideas and engage in the dialogue. Preferably only do this during the end of the Q&A session. This is an academic discussion, so please be respectful and civil towards each other and the speakers. So in terms of today's program, our speaker is Dr. Maike Hamann, who has a background in conservation biology and sustainable science. She completed her PhD at the Stockholm Resilience Center and spent 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow at the Natural Capital Project at the University of Minnesota. While in the US, Maike's work focused on the role that nature plays in supporting human well-being in cities, particularly its role in reducing detrimental climate change impacts. She also pursued an interest in understanding how inequality shapes our relationships with nature, specifically how inequitable distribution of urban nature reinforces environmental injustices in cities around the world. Currently, Maike is based as a researcher at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition at the Stellenbosch University, as Prof. Hanal mentioned, where she continues her work on nature's contribution to people with a focus on developing creative approaches to help decision makers envision more just, sustainable, and resilient futures for both humanity and the planet. Our topic today is an important one, considering the dire state of the environment and accompanying environmental changes, such as climate change, resource depletion, loss of biodiversity, and the transgression of planetary boundaries, all of which have impacts on the health and well-being of humankind and the task and goal of sustainable development. After Maike's presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, which will be facilitated as follows. And during this afternoon, feel free to indicate any questions in the chat box. Let me just show you. You can see on the slide, there are several buttons that you may use to do this. So you may use the chat function as well as the raise hand function at the top or bottom of your screen. Our facilitator, Prof. Anel du Plessis, will ask you to unmute yourself, at which time you may speak. Please remember to mute your mic again afterwards. And after the Q&A, we will have the speaker, or we will give her the opportunity to make some closing remarks if she pleases, after which we will wrap up and Prof. Anel du Plessis will close with some words of thanks. Without any further ado, I would like to hand over to our speaker, Dr. Maike Hamann.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Professor du Plessis and Maricel, for that introduction, and to the whole CLES team in general for this opportunity to present today. I'm very excited. This is a slightly different audience than maybe one that I'm used to. I have no legal studies background, no law background, so I'm very excited to kind of present my perspective on this topic of resilience of environmental systems in cities, and then have a really great discussion about, you know, how you might feel about it, what resonates with you, and, you know, how we can think about it in terms of the law and also just more broadly generally. So I'm very excited, and thank you very much again for this invitation. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. I hope this works. Please tell me if it doesn't. Let's see. Okay, did that work?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Maike.
Perfect, thank you very much. Okay, so as Professor du Plessis already mentioned, for today's conversation and presentation is the resilience of environmental systems and why that's relevant for South African cities. And I come at this from a sort of natural science background, mainly, as sort of Maricel already outlined in her introduction of my background and my academic career so far. But I also, this title, actually, I took it as is from the brief or the prompt that Professor du Plessis sent to me. And I'm sure I could have changed it if I wanted to, but I actually thought it was an interesting starting point because it'll allow me to kind of go through and discuss each one of these concepts and terms that are in that title and sort of kind of put forward my perspective on them. And so that's kind of the plan for this, for the presentation for the next 30 minutes. I want to talk a little bit more about what I think resilience is. I want to talk about this idea of environmental systems, and I want to talk about cities, and then specifically also towards the end more particularly about South African cities in the South African context. So I'm going to start off by talking about resilience. And it's one of those terms, much like probably sustainability, that everyone has sort of a different idea of what resilience is. And there's many different sort of schools of thought. But as Maricel mentioned, I did my PhD at the Stockholm Resilience Center, and that's sort of like a center for sort of thought leadership on resilience theory, resilience thinking. And so we have a specific kind of way of thinking about resilience and defining it. And so I want to take you through a little bit of a tiny bit of almost like a historical view of how this concept of resilience has potentially changed. And I think that most people, when they hear resilience, kind of think of this idea of like bouncing back. And I don't even know what this thing is called, this children's playground thing, but you can imagine, obviously, I mean, I think we've probably all seen one of these, and how they sort of always bounce back to their original position, no matter how hard a child pulls and pushes on it. And it's the same with the sort of rubber band idea. You know, you're pulling a rubber band, and, you know, if it doesn't break, then it'll always snap back to its sort of original size. And I think most people think of resilience a little bit in those terms, like this kind of idea that resilience is the ability to return to the state it was, you know, something was before a perturbation or disturbance. And that's a little bit more of an engineering perspective on resilience, and it's sort of has connotations of other words like stability, persistence, robustness, etc. And that's fine. That's, you know, that's one way to think about resilience. But then if you kind of think a bit about resilience more in the ecological sphere, when you're thinking maybe a little bit more about ecosystems, environmental systems, the resilience concept sort of got a bit refined and evolved a bit. So this is a picture of two lakes. The one on the right is sort of clear and doesn't have a lot of algae in it. The one on the left is clearly, has experienced eutrophication, lots of algae, it's turbid. And essentially what happens in these lakes is that if a lake gets too many nutrients, like phosphorus and nitrogen from, for example, agricultural runoff, it builds up, it changes the system dynamics. Algae have enough food to multiply, make the water more turbid, which means that the ground-dwelling plants, which can actually fix those nutrients, don't get enough light. And then it just all cascades into this often quite sudden flip from a sort of clear state to this turbid state. And it's very, very hard to get a lake back to a clear state once it's gone, once it's been eutrophied. And so this is more of a sort of this idea around ecological resilience. So it's still got some of that sort of bounce back metaphor in it, because the lake on the right, the clear one, it's going to bounce back from certain amounts of sort of nutrient input, but at some point you reach a threshold and then it sort of flips into another state. And so, at that point you've kind of lost resilience and you're in a totally different state. So the idea of resilience in this more ecological context is that resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance, but remain essentially the same. So the lake on the right is absorbing sort of disturbances like nutrient input, but it's still maintaining its sort of function, structure, and identity. Whereas then the lake on the left just crossed that threshold and is now a different lake with different dynamics. But you can see that this kind of definition is now already, about 15, 20 years old. So it's, as with most scientific concepts, the idea of resilience has evolved over time. And before I go to the sort of most recent definition, I just want to go back to this idea of environmental systems, which is also in the title of the talk. And I want to push back just a little bit on this idea of environmental systems, because if you ask yourself some of these questions, like, what is an environmental system? Is there a system that you can sort of consider separate from people in any way? Like, is there an ecosystem, an ecological system that is in some way untouched by human activity? A related but somewhat different question is like, is there something like pure nature? And then what role do people have in environmental or ecological systems? Are they sort of on the outside looking in and managing something that is external to themselves? Or are people really deeply embedded and intertwined with nature? And so I would argue it's more the latter. It's more that people and nature are deeply intertwined, interdependent, and that there is no such thing as a separate social and ecological or environmental system. That really what we're talking about across different scales is actually social ecological systems. So this idea that people use, modify, and care for nature, and nature provides certain material, immaterial benefits, and that this relationship, this back and forth happens not just at sort of the scale of your own household or community or city, but across nations, across the globe. It happens across scales of time. Social ecological systems are complex. They're always evolving. There's sort of potential in complex systems for surprise and emergence and things you didn't see coming, because there's all these complex interactions across scales. And so that's really the lens through which I approach my research, and through which I and people at the Stockholm Resilience Center and people at the Center for Complex Systems in Transition sort of view resilience as well. So what we're interested in is resilience of social ecological systems. So what is social ecological resilience? Well, Carl Volker and his colleagues would say that social ecological resilience is the capacity to adapt or transform in the face of change in social ecological systems, and particularly unexpected change, because remember I said, like, in complex systems often change is quite unexpected. And so it's the capacity to adapt and transform in ways that continues to support human well-being. And so I think those are some really key points. And I want to just pick up on the sort of difference between adaptation and transformation. And just highlighting the somewhat of more recent definition of this. So this is sort of like where we're at currently in this idea and the evolution of the concept of resilience. And so it's just a point about this sort of adapting or transforming. And so if you think about adapting, it's important, right? And it's a little bit still in line with this idea of bouncing back a little bit. So it's like adapting refers to actions that sustain, innovate, and improve development on a current pathway. So imagine you're this kayaker in a river with white water, and you're being bounced around, and you're adapting, and you're navigating, and you maybe get a knock, but you get back on there, and you kind of find your way through. But sometimes that's just not going to cut it, because you're just not going to make it through in one bit, or you've just had enough, or whatever the reason. Sometimes you're just going to get yourself out of the situation, get yourself out of the river system, and transform and do something different, and maybe go on the shore and walk on the shore for a little bit. Like, transforming is more about shifting development into new pathways, or even creating novel ones. And so resilience is really this ability to not just change or bounce back or adapt, but even transform for the better. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind when we talk about resilience of social ecological systems and cities, because it's sort of like we're striving, to keep ourselves open to all possibilities and to transforming to something quite different. So we've talked a little bit about resilience now. We've talked about environmental systems and how, I'm taking more of a view of talking about social ecological systems, these very intertwined, interconnected systems. But why do we care about this stuff for cities? What is it about cities? And why do we care about cities, essentially? And one of the easiest, sort of most obvious answers to this question is because humans are now an urban species. The UN estimates that it was the year 2007. So in 2007, at some point, there's more people that live in cities than that live in rural areas. So in a way, we're now an urban species, and most people live in cities, and that trend is going to continue. And especially if you're thinking about Africa and urban growth in Africa, this is a series of maps from a paper from 2016. So this is a modeling exercise, and you can pick this apart and you can say, they made a lot of assumptions that might not hold true, but I think it's an interesting kind of progression to look at nevertheless, because it shows you where the world's largest cities will be in sort of 2025, 2050, 2100. Because the picture is likely to change. And these are like large mega cities, millions and millions of people. So we look at how, and it kind of looks familiar because there's big cities in North America, there's Mexico City, Sao Paulo, and there's lots of big cities in India and China. And of course, there's Tokyo. But then if you jump forward sort of to 2025, okay, still looks more or less the same. By 2050, you start seeing mega cities appear in Africa and some of the others disappearing, in sort of losing out in relative size to other big and growing cities. And then as you go closer to 2100, this is 2075, you see the trend consolidating, where by 2100, sort of you get all these really large cities in Africa and South Asia. And so I think this is something important to keep in mind. And of course, urbanization and urban growth isn't just about large megacities. It's just as much about smaller cities, large towns, but it's still something to keep in mind. And why do we care about where people live and cities in general? Is obviously not just because most people are going to live in cities, but also because we know that climate change is going to have severe impacts in cities. So we have to kind of think about that and prepare, right? Because we know that cities are particularly prone to poor air quality, especially at the moment anyway, cities in India and China, but also elsewhere. We know that cities are particularly prone to extreme heat events. And a lot of that is due to just the way that cities are built and the materials we use in cities that absorb heat. And, you get the urban heat island effect. And so you get much higher average temperatures in the city than outside of cities. And this isn't just a problem in countries like India, where we've had some very extreme heat, or in Australia, but also in Europe, Northern America. and sometimes those, that's the vulnerable, mainly the old or elderly population that particularly suffer under extreme heat in cities, and the death tolls are sometimes quite extraordinary. And so these are issues that are only going to get worse with climate change, obviously. And another sort of on the other side of the spectrum is the problem of flooding, urban flooding, and not just sort of flooding from rain events and storm events, which are also under climate change predicted to become more frequent and more severe, but even like coastal flooding, storm events where for coastal cities bringing in storm surges, etc. I mean, these are real problems that are likely going to get worse, not better. So, this is not a surprise to anyone, I don't think. And that's also why we've got one of the global goals, one of the sustainable development goals is specifically sustainable cities and communities. But then the question is, okay, so we know that we need to keep, a specific focus on cities and sort of urban communities, but what do resilient and sustainable cities and communities actually look like? I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm sure there's lots of different ways to answer that question. But if you ask me, I think that part of a resilient and sustainable city is nature, because, social ecological systems, resilience, nature has an important part to play. And so nature in cities, you can think of things like green infrastructure. You can think of other words that sort of mean more or less the same thing: nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecological infrastructure. Those are all words people use to describe nature in cities that is fulfilling some kind of function for people. And these are just some examples. You can have street trees, obviously public parks, community gardens. You can have coastal habitats like marshlands and mangroves and all sorts of things. And that also depends a little bit on where you are, what that's going to look like. But essentially, we know that these green infrastructures, these bits of nature and city, they can help improve air quality. Street trees, especially in certain parts of the city, and if they're planted correctly and maintained and all these things, they can improve air quality. You can have, especially parks and sort of large area parks, they can have a really big impact on temperature regulation and bring that extreme heat down. They also, provide services like carbon sequestration. If you care about the amount of CO2 in the air, then, trees and vegetation in cities will help. I mean, it's not going to, change the needle much, but it's going to help. And there's also rivers in cities, and in some cases, if you have this like a healthy river system and a riparian system, you can use that to control flooding. You can even use, some urban residents use the water from these urban rivers to drink even, or for other uses. Like I mentioned before, sort of marshlands or mangroves or other similar coastal ecosystems provide coastal protection against storm surges and potentially even sea level rise to some extent. And then there is, all these other uses of urban green spaces like recreation, physical exercise, so physical health, and then of course also mental health. We know, and there's mounting evidence that, exposure to green spaces, especially for urban residents, reduces stress. It reduces those rumination thoughts, that sort of spiraling, anxious thought processes. And I think we've seen and heard probably from people and friends that over the COVID, pandemic and the last few months of lockdown, people, they miss going outside to green open spaces, to natural spaces, because they need it for their mental health and for their well-being. And I think in some parts of the world, even you can consider urban nature important for biodiversity conservation, especially in some cities in South Africa have some very valuable biodiversity hotspots, or whatever you want to call them, inside their sort of city limits. So that's not to be disregarded at all. So what I'm trying to say is that there's all sorts of benefits that nature and cities can provide. And the good thing is that, a park doesn't just provide one benefit, it provides a whole bunch of benefits. And so, my argument would be that nature-based solutions can help build resilience in cities. And just to drive that point home, they can do that, I think, because they're adaptable, they're multifunctional, and there's less potential for lock-in. So if you're going to like put in a big gray infrastructure stormwater treatment system, then you're stuck with that for the next however many decades, right? But if you're going to go with green infrastructure, potentially, you might, you're going to hopefully get the same stormwater management sort of benefit, but you're also going to have all these other benefits, and you're going to be a little bit more flexible in what you can do with that space if your needs change. So, I would argue that, yes, to some extent, nature-based solutions can help build resilience because they're potentially more transformative for cities, and to build, more resilient, transformed, sort of better futures for cities down the line, because, who knows what's coming. So the idea of green infrastructure is great, and I think I'm a big fan, and I'm hoping that I'm making the point that it can be super useful and beneficial. But of course, there's no such thing as a silver bullet, and context matters, right? Because you can't just take something that works in New York, for example, and just cookie cutter it and put it and plonk it down in Joburg and hope that it does the same amazing things, I mean, there's so many factors that play a role in whether green infrastructure is going to be successful in your city, in your context, in your place. And those aren't just factors like the climate. I mean, if you don't have water to maintain your green infrastructure, well, then, that's probably going to be an issue. But it's even things like, other sort of social, ecological, and technical factors that are going to play a role. And I think that there's also quite a different use of green infrastructure or nature in cities, depending on if you're in the global north and the global south, because in the global north, often the focus is on heat reduction, flooding control, recreation, whereas in the global south, nature in cities does a whole bunch of other things. Like I already mentioned, the biodiversity conservation, but people often depend on nature in cities for their livelihoods, for food, for like livestock grazing, and lots of cultural uses. So there's a lot of context that matters, and especially I just want to highlight the context of sort of even within a household, in a place, like my husband, if I had a husband, I don't have one, but if I had a husband, my husband might love running through the local park because it's great, it's cool, he enjoys the exercise. I might, on the other hand, have a little bit of a different perspective on the local park because I might be a little bit worried about my safety if I have to walk through it to get to work or to the shops. I might kind of think a little bit differently about it, just because of my gender, for example. And so even, within a household, you can have very different perceptions of green infrastructure and its value in a way. And so in a paper that came out in 2019 in Nature Sustainability, we talk about the sort of social, ecological, and technological factors that you should sort of probably consider if you're considering nature-based solutions in your city. You also have to consider whether there's sort of substitutes that might be better placed or cheaper, or, like gray infrastructure substitutes that might be better. But then at the same time, if you put in gray infrastructure, like I mentioned, you might not have all the co-benefits of green infrastructure. Then again, green infrastructure requires maintenance, and there might be people who, for example, are allergic to the pollen, or, so there's just so many things to consider. And in the last few minutes of this talk, I just want to focus on the sort of equity implications, because it's not just that people have different perceptions and values, it's also that there is an equity component, and we know that equity matters. Okay, we know it, and we're seeing it more and more. And the world's most unequal country, as per this Time cover from 2019, this is a picture of Johannesburg, where we see not only the sort of socioeconomic inequality and space inequality on those two sides of that highway, but also green space inequality, right? And so the green space inequality is something that's been coming more and more sort of into the public focus. There's more and more papers. This is just a very small selection of some recent papers. And this is people are looking at this in the US, in Australia, everywhere, including in South Africa. So this is a brand new paper that has just come out. It's led by Zander Venter and some colleagues, also including colleagues from the CST. And they looked at green infrastructure distribution in South African cities. And they basically used satellite imagery to understand where there is green space in urban areas, and then kind of correlated that with where the sort of high income areas and cities are, and where different where the neighborhoods are predominantly, for example, white or black. And so they found a lot of interesting but probably not surprising things. But this is definitely a great study across all urban areas of South Africa. So it's very important in terms of sort of blazing a trail when it comes to this sort of studies of urban green infrastructure inequality. And I think you don't need to worry too much about this graph, but I think what it shows very clearly is this is a graph of the relationship between per capita income and different measures of private and public green infrastructure. So the top row and the bottom row is just different measures of greenness, essentially. And what you can clearly see is that, the richer areas and the whiter areas are, usually above average when it comes to green. And the poorer areas and the areas predominantly Black households are the ones where there's less greenness. And so this study highlights that not only do parks and green areas occur in higher income neighborhoods usually, and in white dominated neighborhoods usually, but also that these spatial inequalities are mirrored in both public and private space. So this isn't just a matter of who has big green gardens. This is also about public green space. And it is obviously something where, the government and, public interests can push towards a more equitable outcome, hopefully. And the other important point of this paper is that the green space inequity has been maintained and entrenched since apartheid. So it hasn't got better, it's got worse. And so this is important to keep in mind, and it sort of is like, well, okay, what does this mean going forward? And I think this is the only time I'm going to mention anything that is in any way, shape, or form potentially sort of legal or has to do with legislation. This I didn't know about this until I read this paper, but South Africa has the National Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, which actually provides a legislative priority to equitable access to green infrastructure. But how can this be implemented? And even though it's an act from 2013, the paper I just presented shows that there hasn't been much. Doesn't look like there's been much change since then. Okay, that's only quote unquote 7 years, but still, how do we can we take this and actually implement it and assure a better sort of distribution of green spaces in cities? And I'm hoping that what I'm conveying to you is that yes, green spaces are great and they convey resilience to cities, but there's always multiple perspectives, multiple perceptions and values, and there's a lot of intersections when it comes to green space with other inequalities and vulnerabilities around access, around transport, around a feeling of belonging and kind of cultural heritage when it comes to green spaces. And I mean, this is just, I don't think I'm telling you anything you don't know, that it's complex. But I also want to leave you with one final thought around green gentrification. So this idea that often, not on purpose, well-meaning green infrastructure development in an area can actually lead to, rising rents, and that can displace people, vulnerable populations, low-income populations that then can't afford living in those areas anymore. And often gentrification happens in, after sort of transport hub development or shopping mall development or something, but it can also happen in, after sort of green infrastructure development. And this is something to keep in mind. And when I was in Minnesota, the group I was with there, they created this sharing in the benefits of a greening city toolkit, which I've linked to there if you're interested. So there's a lot of things you can do to engage with the community in a constructive way to kind of prevent green gentrification from taking place. But at the same time, get vulnerable communities that are already, experiencing less of the benefits of nature and city to actually start benefiting from all of those services and benefits that nature can provide. And so right at the end of my talk, I just want to leave you with this rather odd sort of futuristic picture, but it's just to kind of make you think, what does a social, ecologically resilient and sustainable South African city look like to you? What are South Africa's cities going to look like in 50, 100 years' time? And how are we going to get there? How do we actually build capacity, and capacity at all levels, like personal, government capacity, institutional capacity, all kinds of capacity? How do we build that to continually adapt and transform, which is, what being resilient is all about? And so with those questions, I'll end, and I just want to thank you for your attention. And if you want to get in touch with me, there's my email address or my Twitter handle. So feel free to get in touch after this, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maike. I think it's a bit unfair that you leave us with the most difficult questions there at the end. But thank you very much for a really informative presentation on a complex topic. Even though it may sound as if resilience is something simple, because that definition is quite straightforward, but achieving that is incredibly hard. Transformation and adaptation might take years, many more years than what we actually have at our disposal, given the state of the natural environment.
Right.
Maike, so there's quite a few questions that came in during your talk. I'm going to try my level best to combine some of them and to make the best of the 20 minutes or so that we've got left for the answers.
Great.
So one of the first questions was whether or not you think that, and this is a bit of it's a huge question, but if you can keep it short, in your experience and the research that you and your group is busy with, does it seem attainable for cities to become more resilient given the bad state that the natural environment is already in I suppose South African cities specifically, not necessarily the big metros, but our smaller towns and medium-sized cities as well. So while you think of the answer to that one, there was also a question that we received in advance, even with the registrations, where someone wanted to know to what extent COVID-19 may have impacted on the resilience of the socio-ecological systems in cities. So let me start off with those two, and then we will get to the others.
Thanks so much. Yeah, those are excellent questions, and I can definitely sort of respond to them in some way, but I'd also be super interested to hear what other people on the call think about these important issues. So the first question around whether I think that it's attainable for South African cities to achieve some kind of social ecological resilience, given the often maybe not so great state of natural systems in those cities. Look, I think it depends a little bit on whether you're glass half full, half empty kind of person, or a half empty kind of person. I do think that there are so many arguments to be made, and there's so much sort of groundswell, and also at the global level, like behind big global processes like the SDGs or like the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystem Services and Biodiversity, and there's a lot of push. Okay, a lot of it is being initiated from the global north, but there's also a lot of push in cities of the global south to embrace this idea of nature-based solutions in cities because of some of the points I raised. Like, a lot of the times it's a cheaper option. A lot of the times it's a more flexible option. It prevents you from getting locked into certain development pathways. It has all these multiple co-benefits that, it's a matter of understanding and sort of appreciating and acknowledging these co-benefits. It's not just a matter of kind of putting a dollar value on them. I know that a lot of people, when they think about sort of nature-based solutions or ecosystem services, they immediately think, okay, we can value nature and therefore make an argument to decision makers that, look, this is going to come out better in a cost-benefit analysis. And I think that has a place. And there's a lot of people who do that and who try to find financing mechanisms to push for these kind of green infrastructure solutions. But I think that it's also equally important not to lose sight of the intangible, benefits and the things that we can't put money values to when we talk about green infrastructure, when we talk about nature in cities. And I think it's a lot of the times it sometimes takes something like COVID, like I was mentioning during my presentation, and maybe this is a bit of a segue to the COVID question. It takes something like COVID, a disturbance like that, for people to realize how important things like a walk in the park was to them, and then it's like, oh, damn it, now I can't go to the park, now that's going to impact me negatively. And I never thought I would actually, I didn't think that those sort of nature exposures in city were so important to me. And I don't think it's just a middle class and upper class thing, Poor people also across South Africa, across the world, there's so much, there's a lot of dependence of lower income households on nature in cities. So there's actually a very real, very direct, visceral connection between, urban nature in cities and people who use that nature to graze their livestock, to get wood for, burning, like either heating or cooking at home, to get even medicinal plants or other cultural sort of artifacts. And there's actually, those people are the ones that are going to tell you the quickest when things are changing, when things are being degraded, when that are actually going to tell you the quickest how important nature is for them. So I think that there's, I don't know if there's a good answer to that, because it depends a little bit on your perspective. But what I do know is that there is a mounting evidence, that there's a sort of a good cases being made across the world. And I think that also in South Africa, we've got, a lot of already really great legislation, a lot of really great policy interest in the, the national biodiversity and spatial, what is it called? The spatial planning. I don't even, now I'm going to forget all the acronyms, but there's so many, there's a lot of interest in South Africa already at the government level around the importance of nature and how to protect nature and how to get nature to actually work for us. That I am very optimistic, actually. But other people might have a very different view, so that would be interesting to hear.
Maike, thank you also for, in that answer, having answered a few other questions that we received. I would just like for Matutu and Joandri perhaps to give me an indication whether they have indeed been answered, because that was my understanding that you reflected on this linkage between the rural and the urban, and that what happens in cities is as important for the hinterlands as for the inner cities themselves. And Matutu had a question about green urban transport infrastructure, green urban transport infrastructure, and how important you deem that also for, let me just quickly check, for areas more susceptible to the impacts of climate change. So if you do want to reflect on that a little bit later, while I wait for Matutu to just indicate whether or not she's been answered.
Actually, if I could just ask that person to maybe just clarify a little bit what they mean by green transport infrastructure, that would be great.
Okay, thanks. Wonderful. Matutu, if you can do that, please. And then I'm going to give an opportunity to both Melandri and Felix. I don't think their questions have been answered. So Melandri, if you could pose your question, and you can put on your camera if you like, or just your audio, then Maike can respond to that.
Thanks.
Melandri, I think you should unmute.
Hi. Everyone, sorry, I apologize. This is the first time I'm using MS Teams, so I'm not quite acquainted with
no problem.
Thank you again for a wonderful presentation, Dr. Hamann. So my question was relating to the equity dimension that you mentioned. And it's something that I find quite insightful, and I think it often gets neglected when it comes to issues of environmental justice or climate justice. So my question is, how do you think we can better engage with stakeholders? So how can we get the language right so that we actually get to see what role equity plays or what role intersectionality plays when it comes to addressing broadly nature-based solutions or various other ecological infrastructure issues. And again, also my second question, so just on the same note, again, asking what role do you think that language plays in building or getting the importance of building resilience across to stakeholders, especially municipalities. I know coming from a township myself, or I find that we are already engaging in various resilience building activities and or nature-based solutions, but we don't necessarily have the terminology correct. And how can we communicate this for other stakeholders effectively? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Melandri. Those are all very excellent questions. And I think I'm going to answer the language question first before I come back to equity, because I think it's such a good point you're making that, people are already engaging in resilience building. They're just not calling it resilience building, right? And that's fine. That's I think, often these conversations about terminology and definitions is very academic. But actually, in South Africa, it's interesting because, I saw this happen with the term ecosystem services, which almost from the start was relatively controversial because it kind of implies that, so basically ecosystem services is that this idea that nature is providing benefits to people. But then the term ecosystem services almost sort of took that idea and made it almost interactional. And then we're talking about services, and then you pay for services, and you're kind of implying this whole capitalist sort of economics framing when you're talking about ecosystem services. And a lot of people were very upset by that. And this felt that it didn't sort of fit in their sort of worldview of what nature is and how the role that nature plays in their lives. And so actually over time, if you look at the most recent sort of evolution of that concept in the Intergovernmental Panel, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, which is kind of the biodiversity and ecosystem services equivalent of the IPCC. They actually prefer the term nature's contributions to people, which is a little maybe less sort of transactional, and in South Africa, I think what people also didn't like the term ecosystem services, especially sort of in the policy and government circles. And so they were resonating much more with the term ecological infrastructure. And so, okay, well, maybe I don't like the term ecological infrastructure, but it seemed to work with decision makers. And so, I think you got to be a little bit flexible with these terms and see what works for different audiences. And I think a lot of these terms and a lot of these concepts like resilience, like sustainability, like even ecosystem services, they're like boundary objects. So they're like these terms, these things, these ideas, concepts that span multiple disciplines, different stakeholder groups, different practice groups, and everyone maybe thinks slightly differently about them, but in some way they bring people together. At least they open the door to conversation. And so I think maybe by starting with the way I define resilience, I think maybe that was a little bit cheeky, but also because I think like sometimes people are still a bit too stuck on this idea of bouncing back. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there because I think it's more than that. And it's important that it's more than that, right? Because we don't always want to just bounce back to what we had before. Sometimes what we had before isn't great. We want to like almost bounce forward, to something better. So So I think that there is a sort of often a disconnect between language in terms of being quite sort of technical or like framed in sort of infrastructure terms and that kind of thing, when actually what people sort of on the ground resonate much more with is a sort of much more intuitive framings around how they use nature. And that I think that comes back to equity, because it's not just about the distribution of green infrastructure, for example. We know that equity is not just about distributional sort of equality, it's also about recognition, it's also about participation. So how do we get people, a diversity of voices involved, and not just have them involved to have a seat at the table, but make their voices count and recognize their different views and their different values and their different languages. And it's especially important, I think, in the conversation around green infrastructure, because there is quite a disconnect also between the global north and the global south about how we see green infrastructure as compared to a lot of these concepts and ideas that come from the global north. And so, there's layers upon layers. And if you ask me, like, how do we engage people? How do we make sure people are part of the conversation? I don't have a good answer for that, apart from sort of the general answer of like, how do you do good community engagement? I mean, there's so many different ways to do it and so many ways to really mess it up. And I think that especially the green infrastructure ecosystem services community that often comes from a more natural science background. It's just how the field evolved. We as scientists from that background often lack the ability, the capacities, the knowledge, the skills to engage well and fairly and equitably in these communities. Like, those are skills that you get from, a different kind of like more social science background. And that's why it's so important in these kinds of projects and with green infrastructure to take it into at least an interdisciplinary lens, if not a transdisciplinary lens. How do we engage the community in these projects? How do we make sure that, the benefits are real and going to the people who really need them? I think I should probably stop talking, but I mean, that's a little bit of what I would say in response.
Thanks very much, Maike. We've also had 3 questions that I'm trying to combine to the best of my ability. They connect with, or they deal with the law, but don't get a fright here.
Okay.
They deal with SPLUMA, the Spatial Land Use and Management Act, but they go actually beyond. It's about space and equitable access to green space in particular. So we've had Felix, and I'm sorry, Felix, if you did want to have the mic, you can just shout and I'll give you the opportunity, but I would like to combine these 3 questions. Felix asked, what's the role of the law in this from your natural science perspective? Do you see a role for the law at all? Then we've got Nantlantla mentioning that it is often law excluding people from green spaces, and she's specifically referring to informal traders who, in terms of city bylaws, for example, are prevented or precluded from entering parks and green spaces in cities, for example. And then Semi had a question on the implementation of SPLUMA. Do you think that it has been properly implemented? So you mentioned that you've not been that well acquainted with SPLUMA before, but I think if you take those spatial justice principles that we have at the start of SPLUMA, the question might just very well be, do we see spatial justice? And I want to be as bold as to say that I think us as lawyers often also don't understand justice that well. There's a difference between the law and justice, even though we speak of lady justice. There you go, Maike.
Yeah, thanks for those. I mean, I must say the last one on like sort of my reflection on whether SPLUMA has been implemented, or I don't know. To be honest, I just can't tell. I'm not sufficiently sort of embedded in the South African system here to be able to tell that. I mean, my research often is not necessarily focused on South Africa per se. So a lot of my research is more at the global level. So I must be completely honest, and I don't know. It would be great if other people here have any reflections on that. I think that, you know, the other question around the role of law and laws excluding people from access to urban nature. So as I was putting together this presentation, and I kind of went through this example of the lake, you know, the lake going from clear to turbid, and the fact that actually what is playing a role there is a change in a slow variable, sort of nutrient buildup, right? And the nutrients build up and they build up and they build up in the lake until, you know, one day it just flips. And I actually was thinking, you know, I feel like the law is a lot like that. It's like, it's often when you're just looking, I mean, for me, who, like I said, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not in legal studies at all. If I look at the law, I often think like, oh my God, it's changing so slowly, and it's frustratingly slow. And yes, the arc of history bends towards justice, but so slowly, you know, like, and then it's like, okay, well, so maybe it's a little bit like those slow variables in these systems where it's just like it's building, and then at some point, actually, a big decision gets made, a big case gets brought before it, and it sets a precedent or whatever. Like, so I think that there definitely is a role of law. I see it more in terms of like a slow variable that can, you know, build up to have very significant changes. But maybe other people think that that is a very naive way to think about the law. I'm very happy to be corrected. Maybe it is much more stochastic, much more changeable than that. So please let me know. But I mean, the answer, basically the short answer to, do I see a role for law? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I was even thinking of, and maybe this gets a little bit at the question about the law excluding people. The one of the laws of South Africa, that, you know, seeing water, sufficient clean water as a human right, is actually such an interesting, you know, case for me to, like, what if we had that for access to nature? Like, what if it was a human right that everyone had, you know, access to functioning healthy ecosystems for their, you know, whatever they needed for their well-being? And maybe if that's traders that need to access, you know, the park for their, you know, livelihoods, you know, then that's one thing. Of course, there's a big trade-off there. There's like, obviously, if I was a park manager, I'd be like, yeah, but how can I make sure that there's not like a run on park resources when we're actually, you know, our objective is, you know, biodiversity conservation, or like the protection of the natural resources in our park. So there's obviously trade-offs, but that's a political process. That's what, you know, that's a social process that we have to figure out. Like, there's always trade-offs. There's always winners and losers. So how can we use the law to sift through some of that? You know, I think that's a very important role of the law. And if there's a law that is causing trouble, then, you know, there's obviously processes to change that. So I mean, I do think that I think that the great thing about law, as opposed to other political processes and policy processes, you know, that they might take longer, but they feel, and maybe again I might be wrong, but they feel a lot more stable and like permanent. So that's something, you know, in terms when you're thinking of long-term sustainability, I think the role has a very important role to play, because, you know, you can have policies that protect an area and you can declare something a protected area, but maybe that can change really quickly. But maybe something that's enshrined in the law is a little bit more protected from those changes. I don't know. This is, again, where I'm out of my depth. So it would be great to hear other people's opinions.
Thanks very much, Maike. I'm going to give an opportunity. I want to get back to Matutu, who had the question about the green transport infrastructure, and Nicoline also had a question. So I'm going to give them the mics. But I, first of all, want to abuse this position of chairing and being able to ask a question. So recently, and I think in the face of COVID, there's really big question marks around the world economy, and certainly also national economies in Africa. And listening to you, I was wondering, how much can we do without having the financial resources? And I'm talking about the level of the state, the level of the town or the city, the neighborhood, but even us having small families or living on our own. What can we do without having to buy a single thing where there's no money involved? How can we actually make a constructive and positive contribution to the safeguard of socio-ecological systems without needing financial resources?
I think that there's a lot, like, I think COVID has actually shown the amazing power of like collective action and sort of civil action around South Africa, especially in the cities where neighborhoods got together in these community action networks and started organizing among themselves. And sure, maybe there's some, you know, some funding requirements, but a lot of people did a lot just by, you know, volunteering their time, their skills. So I think that, you know, if you know, harnessing some of that energy to get involved at the community level, to understand what's going on in your community in terms of social ecological systems, like in terms of like, are there sort of development plans? Are there plans to maybe implement some kind of green infrastructure project, or to get rid of, you know, natural spaces for some other development project, or like inform yourself, see if your community has some kind of like community group that is interested in these kinds of things. And also things like, I mean, it sounds silly, you know, like things like join a beach cleanup crew, or, you know, like, but those things matter because, you know, the thing that is important to remember, I think, about urban nature is that most people, like, I don't know the percentage, but I would guess it's really high. Like 80% of people who live in cities, the only exposure they're going to have to nature is their urban nature, because they can't just pack up a car and drive to Kruger for a weekend or hang out in some other national park. They don't have the funds and the means to do this. So their only interaction with nature is within the city. So it's really important that urban nature fulfills this connection for people to something beyond themselves, to something bigger, to the natural environment. And I think that's why it's so important. Like Cape Town and other South African cities have all this amazing park network, and, you know, it's open to everyone. And that's where you can also make a big difference. You can support your local pocket parks, your small little nature reserves that are struggling, that hardly have money for anything, and you can go and spend your time or whatever. Like, so there's quite a lot you can do at a micro level. I think that kind of builds up.
Thanks. That's an inspiring note. Maike, I want to check whether Matutu is around. Matutu, you can clarify your question of earlier. I'm going to ask Maike to respond, and then immediately after, Nicoline, in the interest of time, you can pose your question and we will conclude with that answer.
Prof, sorry for interrupting. Matutu indicated that she's having connection problems, so she keeps dropping off, so she won't be posing her question.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks for that, Maricel. Nicoline?
Hi, Maike. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation. It was so enlightening. You mentioned nature-based solutions and also the water scarcity issue. So I was thinking, since South Africa is one of the most water scarce countries in the world, I was just wondering, do you have any recommendations specifically concerning how to improve resilience via these nature-based solutions in view of this massive issue? And while access to water is still an issue. So thank you very much.
No, that's excellent. I think some of these things I just had to just sort of brush past, but it really is, when you're thinking, even the pictures I showed you of nature-based solutions, they're like pictures, a lot of them are from the US, and, you know, where there's like, I lived in Minneapolis, which is in a state that has the byline land of 10,000 lakes. There's no water issue in Minneapolis, right? They can put in parks and green spaces wherever they want. But obviously, if you're a Cape Town or if you're a Dubai, like what does that mean for you? You can't just put a park somewhere, you know, even though Dubai tries. But that brings with it all kinds of other sustainability issues, right? When a city like Dubai tries to sort of emulate other cities that have a completely different climate and setup. So I think in Cape Town, for example, like what I find so interesting is like if we just expand our idea of what nature-based solutions can be, or like, for example, the Working for Water program, you know, the way that the Working for Water program gets rid of sort of alien invasives, which ideally then has the effect that there's actually more water available because it's the alien vegetation that sucks up most water compared to the sort of indigenous flora. So like that program, that sort of getting rid of one kind of nature for another kind of nature. I mean, that is in a way that is a nature-based solution to a problem of drought, right? So we can expand our the way we think about these things. And of course, in a city like Cape Town, maybe we can't have a huge urban forest, but there are definitely other ways we can use the local indigenous vegetation, and other cities like Phoenix in Arizona, for example, they've thought very creatively around actually, in a way, in arid environments, you can be a lot more creative and have these really interesting nature art installations where you're kind of helping nature along a little bit. Okay, so maybe you have some kind of really cool shade structure, and because the plants are all quite small, that would be a similar issue in the Cape, I think. But there, you're open by opening yourself up to the option of nature-based solutions. You're also opening yourself up to so many other more creative alternative uses of urban space, which I think sometimes gets lost when we only think in terms of gray infrastructure. And like I said, I don't think green infrastructure is always the answer. Like in some places, it's just not going to work because you're not going to get the right species of trees to do what you needed to do, whatever. But there are just so many more options that we can, think of when we think outside the box of gray infrastructure. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Maike. Thanks also, Nicoline, for that question, and everybody else who engaged in the discussion. I think it was really enlightening. And Maike, you might be pleased to know that quite a few of the things and the solutions you talked about today are actually featuring in South African law and has been doing so long before SDG 11.
Okay, good.
And even the new urban agenda. So it's just a matter of perhaps the lawyers also not having the language to reach out to the scientists. And I think that just underscores how important it is that we have this kind of conversations where we across disciplines reach out to each other and start the discussions. Obviously, we've got huge challenges with implementing that beautiful law, right through from Section 24 of the Constitution to SPLUMA, the National Environmental Management Act, and even our local government legislation in South Africa, most of which was adopted between 1998 and 2001, already made it very clear that urban development in South Africa must also consider environmental interests. So it's been on the cards for many, many years. But obviously the proof lies in eating the implementation pudding. Maike, on behalf of everyone at CLES, thank you so much for this afternoon. You have given us permission to share this presentation via our social media platforms and on our website. I know that you also want to do that on your end. You are welcome to do so. And I hope that this has been the start of perhaps some future collaboration.
That would be wonderful. Thank you again so much for this opportunity. I must say that it's, like you said, it's exactly this kind of working across disciplines that we need. And I'm so excited for this, this start. Thank you so much.
Thanks again. And also to everybody who joined us this afternoon. We hope to see you at our next critical conversation, and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.